Miss Marple and the Woman Who Saw Her Own Death. Chapter 1. The Prediction. The train to Mellingford slowed as it approached the quaint countryside station, its whistle cutting through the still afternoon air. Miss Marple, seated comfortably by the window, watched as fields gave way to thatched cottages and quiet, winding lanes. There was a particular stillness about the village, an air of something unsaid. She had come at the invitation of Mrs. Edith Weatherby, an old friend from her younger days. Their correspondence had been sporadic over the years, but Edith had written to her recently, insisting that a visit was long overdue. As Miss Marple stepped onto the platform, Edith greeted her warmly but with a certain reserved energy, as if something weighed on her mind. They made their way through the narrow streets, the village eerily subdued, as though holding its breath. Inside Edith's charming yet slightly cluttered home, tea was promptly served. The scent of freshly baked scones filled the air, yet there was an unmistakable tension. Edith's hands trembled slightly as she poured the tea. "You've come at an interesting time, Jane," she said, her voice laced with something unspoken. Miss Marple simply nodded, sensing that there was more to be said, and that, in time, it would be. As Edith stirred her tea with deliberate slowness, she finally spoke. "Do you remember Estelle Carrington? She married Richard, the banker's son. A lovely girl, always rather delicate. Lately, though, well, the whole village is talking about her." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "Talking about her?" Edith leaned in slightly, voice hushed. "She's been saying the most peculiar thing, Jane. She claims she has foreseen her own death." The words lingered between them, absurd, yet unsettlingly firm. "Foreseen?" Miss Marple repeated. "She told anyone who would listen. 3 days, Jane. She says she has seen it, her own death, happening in exactly 3 days." Miss Marple took a measured sip of her tea, watching her friend over the rim of the cup. The certainty in Edith's voice, the subtle tension in her hands, suggested this was not idle village gossip. "People are saying she's unwell," Edith continued, "or that she's always been fanciful. But there's something about her. She truly believes it." Miss Marple set her cup down. A woman who predicts her own death. Either a tragedy was imminent, or something far more curious was unfolding. By the time Miss Marple met Estelle Carrington, the evening air had taken on a crisp edge, the sort that carried whispers through narrow village streets. Edith had arranged for them to meet at the Carrington residence, a stately yet somber house on the edge of the village, its ivy-covered walls shrouded in the last light of dusk. Estelle was not what Miss Marple had expected. There was no hysteria, no frantic proclamations. Instead, the woman before her was poised but tired, her eyes darkened by something more than lack of sleep. "I have seen my own death, Miss Marple." Her voice was steady, yet there was an undercurrent of something brittle beneath it. "It will happen in 3 days." Miss Marple studied her carefully. The words were spoken not as a plea, nor as a confession, but as a certainty. "You sound quite sure of it, my dear." Estelle gave a small, almost apologetic smile. "That's the trouble, isn't it? I wish I weren't." Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap, observing her with quiet attentiveness. "How did you come to this certainty?" Estelle hesitated for only a moment before answering. "It wasn't a dream. It wasn't a feeling. I saw it, Miss Marple, as though it had already happened. And the worst part?" Her hands tightened slightly over the arms of her chair. "I know I won't be able to stop it." A pause, then a quiet exhalation of breath, heavy with something Miss Marple recognized well, genuine fear. By the next morning, Estelle Carrington's ominous prediction had spread through the village like ripples in a pond. At the local grocer's, by the churchyard gate, in hushed conversations over freshly brewed tea, everywhere there was talk of the woman who claimed to have seen her own death. Some dismissed it with a knowing smile, calling it hysteria, an overactive imagination, the sort of thing one might expect from a woman with too much time and too many novels. Others, more skeptical, whispered of omens and fate, uneasy but unwilling to say so aloud. Her husband, Richard Carrington, had been the most pragmatic, perhaps too much so. A man of finance, measured and distant, he had little patience for what he called Estelle's nonsense. "She's always had a flair for dramatics," he was overheard saying. "This will pass, just as all her fancies do." But those who truly knew Estelle, her dear friend Lillian Drake, the housemaid Betty, even the mild-mannered vicar's wife, had their doubts. Estelle was not given to melodrama, nor was she a woman who sought attention. If she had spoken so certainly of her own death, what then had she seen? Miss Marple listened, filing away each reaction, each dismissal, each casual remark. The village believed it knew Estelle's mind, but Miss Marple had observed something they had not. Estelle was not indulging in fantasy. She was afraid. That afternoon, Miss Marple found herself once again in Estelle's company, seated in the drawing room of the Carrington residence, where the air carried the faintest trace of lavender and unease. Estelle sat with perfect posture, hands resting in her lap, but Miss Marple noticed a slight tremor in her fingers. The delicate way she held her teacup, as though steadying herself, the way her gaze flickered, as though looking for something, or someone, who was not there. "You are very certain of it," Miss Marple said at last, carefully neutral, watching the younger woman closely. Estelle's lips pressed into a thin line. "I am." "Yet you don't seem frightened," Miss Marple observed, tilting her head slightly. "Not in the way one would expect." A small breath of laughter escaped Estelle's lips, humorless, resigned. "That's the peculiar thing, isn't it? I'm not afraid of dying, Miss Marple. I'm afraid of how I know." She set her cup down, the porcelain clinking softly against the saucer. "It isn't a dream. It isn't a feeling. It's as though the memory of it already exists." Her hands curled slightly. "And yet, I am still here." Miss Marple, ever observant, noted the way Estelle's voice tightened on the last words, as if there were more she wished to say but could not. "Perhaps," Miss Marple said gently, "your mind has seen something your conscious self has not yet recognized. A detail, a shadow, a warning." Estelle's breath caught, just for a moment. Then, as if realizing it, she quickly forced a smile. Miss Marple had seen enough. This was not hysteria. This was a woman who knew something she could not name. And in 3 days, she would be dead. Chapter 2. The Fatal Night. As the evening deepened, Mellingford held its breath. The villagers, though rational people, could not help but glance toward Carrington House, their eyes betraying unease. Some spoke of coincidence, of imagination running wild, dismissing Estelle's ominous prediction as hysteria. Others, particularly the older folk, muttered of things best left unspoken, invoking superstition under their breath. The pub was quieter than usual. Even the clinking of glasses seemed subdued, conversations hushed. A group of men stood outside, pretending not to watch the Carrington home, but stealing furtive glances toward its windows. Lillian Drake, Estelle's closest friend, had been seen pacing near the vicarage, wringing her hands. Richard Carrington, her husband, had retired early, or so he claimed. The Dr. Henry Graves had made an uncharacteristically late visit to a patient, his absence duly noted. Miss Marple sat in Edith Weatherby's sitting room, knitting quietly. She had seen such anticipation before, not of curiosity, but of dread. People did not truly believe in premonitions until one threatened to come true. A clock chimed the half-hour. The hour drew near. The village, in all its skepticism and doubt, waited. At exactly midnight, a scream tore through the stillness. A single piercing sound, high, jagged, filled with horror. Doors flung open. Faces appeared at windows. A few brave souls ventured out, drawn toward the Carrington residence. The front door had been left ajar, swinging slightly in the night air. It was Lillian Drake who reached her first. She stood frozen at the foot of the grand staircase, her breath shallow, her hands clasped to her mouth, as if to contain another scream. Estelle Carrington lay sprawled at the bottom of the staircase, her body twisted at an unnatural angle. Her silk dressing gown, deep blue, precisely as she had described, was eerily pristine, as though untouched by violence. Richard Carrington arrived moments later, eyes widening in genuine or well-feigned horror. Dear God. His voice faltered. Behind him, Dr. Graves pushed forward, instinctively kneeling to check for signs of life. But there were none. Someone whispered, "She knew." Others muttered prayers, their skepticism crumbling under the weight of what lay before them. Estelle Carrington had predicted her own death, and now she was dead. Miss Marple stepped forward with measured calm, observing what others could not yet see. The house was too quiet. No signs of a struggle, no gasping final words. Just a body, perfectly still, perfectly positioned. Her keen eyes swept over the details. Estelle's hands, one lay open, palm facing upward, yet the other was tightly clenched. Miss Marple noticed the edges of fabric peeking through her fingers, a torn scrap of something dark. Dr. Graves straightened. "She fell," he announced, though his voice lacked confidence. "The stairs. She must have tripped." "Tripped," Miss Marple repeated softly. "Yet there is not a single wrinkle in her gown." The doctor faltered, eyes flickering toward the body. Indeed, her dressing gown lay perfectly smooth, untouched by the violent descent one would expect. Miss Marple's gaze lifted to the staircase, then back to Estelle. She had seen many accidents in her time, many misfortunes, but something about this one was wrong. The air itself felt too still, as if something had been carefully arranged before their arrival. She glanced once more at Estelle's clenched fist. There was a truth held within it, waiting to be revealed. And Miss Marple, ever patient, would uncover it. Miss Marple's sharp eyes fell upon Estelle's right hand. While one lay open, still and relaxed, the other was tightly clenched, a final desperate grasp at something unseen. Carefully, she knelt beside the body, her movements unhurried, deliberate. With a gentle touch, she pried open Estelle's fingers, revealing a small scrap of torn fabric, dark against her pale skin. It did not match her dressing gown. Dr. Graves, still kneeling on the other side, frowned. "Must have been caught on something as she fell," he muttered. Miss Marple gave a small polite nod but said nothing. Fabric did not simply tear itself in a fall, nor did the dying clutch at air unless there was something to hold on to. Behind her, the hushed whispers of the gathered villagers grew. Someone, perhaps Lillian, gave a quiet, involuntary gasp. Miss Marple heard it, noted it. Richard Carrington's voice cut through the murmurs. "This is dreadful. Dreadful. But it must have been an accident. Estelle. She was prone to these fits of imagination. She could have tripped in a panic." Miss Marple looked up at him, her expression unreadable. Did he believe his own words? Or was he hoping others would? Her fingers traced the rough, torn edges of the fabric. If Estelle had held onto it at the very last moment, then someone close enough to be grasped, had been with her. Someone who did not wish to be seen. The villagers were already whispering of fate, of Estelle's eerie prediction come true. It was all too convenient. Miss Marple, however, did not believe in such things. If Estelle's death had been inevitable, if fate had decreed it, why was there a torn piece of fabric in her hand? Why had she clutched at something, or someone, before she fell? This was not fate. This was design. She glanced at the staircase once more. The fall had been silent. Too silent. No frantic cry, no sudden thud of missteps. Estelle had not simply slipped. A premonition coming true was one thing, but a premonition being carefully orchestrated to look fulfilled, that was something else entirely. And Miss Marple was beginning to suspect that Estelle had been meant to die exactly as she had foretold, because someone had ensured it. She folded her hands in her lap, her expression as mild as ever. There was a killer among them, and they had played their role very, very well. Chapter 3. The Suspects. The morning after Estelle Carrington's death, Mellingford awoke to a village split in two. Some clung to the eerie truth of her prophecy, muttering about fate, destiny, and things beyond human understanding. They spoke in hushed voices, casting uneasy glances at Carrington House, as if the walls themselves had secrets to tell. Others, more practical, more skeptical, dismissed such notions outright. "There's no mystery here," said the butcher's wife, shaking her head as she handed over a parcel of lamb chops. "A fall is a fall." "But it wasn't, was it?" Miss Marple, ever watchful, noted the unspoken tension in the air. It was not just fear of the unknown that gripped the village, but something deeper, something sharper. People were whispering not only about Estelle's death, but about each other. Richard Carrington, the grieving husband who did not seem to grieve enough. Lillian Drake, the dear friend who had last spoken to Estelle in anger. Dr. Henry Graves, the man who had so easily dismissed Estelle's fears, and now found himself questioned. And Matthew Lawson, the bookseller who had always watched Estelle from afar, but never too far. Miss Marple sipped her tea, watching the village turn in on itself. The question of what had happened was one thing. The question of who had made it happen was another. And that was the question that truly mattered. Miss Marple had always believed that grief reveals as much as it conceals. Richard Carrington, a man of means and measured restraint, had spent the morning handling affairs. Not mourning, not retreating in sorrow, handling affairs. At the solicitor's office, he was overheard speaking in even, calculated tones, inquiring about the execution of Estelle's will. It had been revised recently, though the details remained uncertain. "Terrible business," he said later, when he passed Miss Marple outside the post office. "A dreadful accident. My poor wife. She was always prone to these notions. A fragile mind, easily swayed." Miss Marple offered a gentle nod, watching him carefully. His words were curiously distant, not cold exactly, but lacking in any genuine dismay. A man who mourned the inconvenience of loss, rather than the loss itself. He did not seem angry. He did not seem distraught. He simply seemed prepared. As he turned to leave, she asked almost absently, "Had she spoken to you about her premonition?" He hesitated, a fraction of a second, but enough. "She spoke to everyone about it," he said with a practiced sigh. "I tried to tell her. Thoughts like that can become self-fulfilling, you know." And with that, he left. Miss Marple, watching him disappear down the lane, knew better. Self-fulfilling or carefully fulfilled. There was a difference, and Richard Carrington seemed to understand that difference all too well. Lillian Drake had always been Estelle's closest friend, and yet, in the days before her death, their friendship had frayed at the edges. She had been the first to arrive at Carrington House on the night of the tragedy, the first to cry out at the sight of Estelle's body, and the first to swear that this was no accident. "I knew something was wrong," she said, voice trembling as she gripped Miss Marple's hand. "I should have done something. I should have—" She trailed off, blinking rapidly, as though chasing a thought she dared not voice aloud. Miss Marple, ever patient, waited. Lillian inhaled, shaking her head. "We argued, you know, 2 days before she died." "About what?" "Nothing," Lillian said too quickly. Then, correcting herself, "I mean, trivial things. I was worried about her. She had been so convinced about this premonition, and I told her it was nonsense. She became angry. She said I wasn't listening." Miss Marple noted the way Lillian's hands twisted in her lap, fingers tightening and loosening as she spoke. "And were you?" Miss Marple asked gently. Lillian blinked. "Was I what?" "Listening." A pause, a hesitation, then quietly, "No." Miss Marple patted her hand. "Tell me, dear, when you last saw Estelle, was she afraid of dying?" Lillian swallowed hard. She was afraid of something. And that, Miss Marple thought, was not the same thing at all. Dr. Henry Graves was a man of certainty. A physician of many years, he prided himself on logic over speculation, science over superstition. It was no surprise, then, that he had dismissed Estelle's premonition outright. "She was always prone to nervous fits," he had told the villagers only days before her death. A classic case of self-induced anxiety. And yet, now that her prediction had come true, Dr. Graves seemed less assured. His hands were steady, but Miss Marple noted the small hesitation in his movements, the way he avoided direct questions about the night of Estelle's death. Had he truly been elsewhere when she fell? More curious still was his relationship with Estelle. A doctor and his patient, certainly. But was there more? "She trusted him," said Lillian Drake, her voice tinged with something unreadable. "Too much, perhaps. She once told me she confided in him things she wouldn't tell Richard. That was worth noting. A confidant, a man who dismissed her fears, and yet, had he known something after all?" Dr. Graves kept his chin high, his answers firm. But there was something in his eyes, not grief nor guilt, but a flicker of unease that Miss Marple did not miss. Matthew Lawson was a quiet man, unnoticed by most, save for one peculiar detail: his preoccupation with Estelle Carrington. He was the village bookseller, mild-mannered, reserved, known for his unassuming nature. He rarely spoke unless spoken to, and yet he had attended every gathering Estelle hosted, standing just at the edges of conversation, watching. "She was remarkable," he said simply when Miss Marple asked about her. His voice was steady, but his fingers twisted the edge of his cuff, just slightly. "So full of ideas." "And yet, you never spoke to her much," Miss Marple noted. He hesitated. "She didn't notice me." An odd choice of words. Not we were not acquainted, but she didn't notice me. A quiet obsession, perhaps. Lillian had recalled once finding Matthew lingering outside Carrington House, his excuse vague, his presence unremarked upon. And yet, on the night of Estelle's death, Matthew had been absent, or so he claimed. Miss Marple studied him a moment longer. He did not seem dangerous, but obsession, unchecked, could take many forms. Miss Marple had lived long enough to know that guilt does not always shout. It often whispers. She sat at Edith Weatherby's table, stirring a lump of sugar into her tea, her eyes wandering over the villagers who came and went that morning. Who avoided eye contact? Who seemed restless? Who laughed a little too loudly? Lillian Drake wrung her hands, eyes flickering whenever Richard Carrington's name was mentioned. Dr. Graves kept his voice measured, but his fingers tapped absently on his desk, betraying an undercurrent of tension. Richard Carrington had been so carefully composed, but when Miss Marple mentioned Estelle's will, there had been a fraction of a pause, just long enough to take note of. And Matthew Lawson, his words had been polite, his demeanor mild, yet Miss Marple had seen the way his shoulders stiffened when he heard Estelle's name. One of them knew more than they were saying, and Miss Marple, ever patient, would find out who. Chapter 4. The Clues and Red Herrings. Miss Marple sat in quiet contemplation, the scrap of dark fabric resting on the table before her. A small thing, easily overlooked. But Estelle had clutched it tightly in death, her fingers locked around it in silent defiance. It did not match her clothing. She turned it over delicately, tracing the edges where it had been torn. The frayed thread spoke of struggle, not accident. If Estelle had grasped this fabric in her final moments, it could only mean one thing. Someone had been with her. Someone close enough to reach, close enough to tear free. Miss Marple's gaze lifted as Edith Weatherby poured her another cup of tea. "So odd, isn't it?" Edith murmured. "One would expect her to have caught the banister, not—" She gestured to the fabric. "Yes." Miss Marple agreed mildly, though her mind was elsewhere. Banisters do not wear cloth. People do. She recalled the night of Estelle's death, the gathered villagers, the expressions of shock, of horror, and of something else, guilt. There was a piece of clothing somewhere, among them, missing just this scrap, and Miss Marple would find it. Miss Marple let Edith's words drift into silence, her thoughts returning to Estelle's final conversation. "The staircase is too silent." It had seemed an odd remark at the time, one Miss Marple had set aside. But now, in the light of new evidence, it took on an unsettling meaning. She pictured the grand staircase. A house of that age should creak, a home lived in, a structure settled with time, would not allow footsteps to pass unnoticed. Unless— She leaned back slightly, letting the thought unfurl. Had the silence itself been a warning? Had Estelle noticed something too late? A footstep that should have sounded but did not? Miss Marple's fingers tapped gently against the armrest. It was not the absence of noise that mattered. It was the expectation of it. Something had been altered, and Estelle, with the same sharpness of mind that had foreseen her own death, had noticed. Too late to save herself, but perhaps just in time to name her killer. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple found herself speaking with Betty, the Carringtons' housemaid. A timid girl, hands wringing at her apron, eyes darting about as though fearing reprimand. I don't understand it, ma'am," Betty confessed, lowering her voice. She locked herself in. I know she did. I heard the bolt slide into place." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "And yet, she was found at the foot of the stairs." Betty swallowed. "That's what's wrong, isn't it? No one could have got in." Miss Marple studied her carefully. The girl's fear was genuine, but it was not the fear of guilt. It was the fear of something unexplained. Locks could be picked. Duplicate keys could be made. But a bolted door? That was trickier. Unless— Her thoughts returned to the fabric in Estelle's hand, the silent staircase, the absence of a struggle. "Betty, tell me, when you found her, was the door still bolted?" Betty hesitated. No, it was open. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. And did you open it? The girl paled. No, ma'am. Then someone else had. Someone who should not have been there at all. Miss Marple had always believed that timing was rarely coincidental. When a person altered their will mere days before their death, it was never a matter of chance. Seated in Mr. Albertson's office, the village solicitor, she listened attentively as he shifted uncomfortably in his chair, glancing over his spectacles at the document before him. Yes, he admitted at last. Mrs. Carrington did request a revision. It was rather, well, unexpected. Miss Marple folded her hands. And what precisely did she change? Albertson hesitated, then sighed. She increased a bequest to Lillian Drake, removed a certain investment meant for her husband, and... He cleared his throat. She named a new beneficiary for a portion of her estate. A personal matter, she said. Miss Marple inclined her head, waiting. Albertson adjusted his glasses. A sum was designated to Matthew Lawson. That was curious. The quiet bookseller, the man Estelle had barely spoken to, had suddenly become worthy of inheritance. And then there was Richard Carrington, a man who stood to lose more than he had expected. The timing was too neat. Miss Marple thanked Albertson politely, leaving him to fidget with his papers. She already knew the truth. Someone had discovered the changes before Estelle's death, and that meant her will was not merely a revision, it was a motive. That evening, under the watchful eye of the housemaid Betty, Miss Marple found what she had been looking for. A letter tucked away in Estelle's drawer, its edges creased with hurried handling. The handwriting was unmistakably Estelle's, but the contents were far more troubling. I know now. It was never a premonition. It was something I saw, something I was not meant to see. The ink trailed slightly, as if her hand had hesitated, knowing the weight of the words. I will set things right. I cannot pretend I do not know. I will make my decision tomorrow. After that, I hope to be safe. Miss Marple exhaled slowly. Estelle had not foreseen her own death. She had understood it. She had discovered something dangerous. And perhaps believing she could reason with the truth, she had left behind a trail of breadcrumbs for the one person who might piece it all together. A revised will, a silent staircase, a clenched fist gripping fabric. Someone had silenced Estelle before she could act, but Miss Marple had no intention of letting that silence remain unbroken. She folded the letter carefully, her decision made. It was time to set a trap. Chapter 5. The Unraveling of Secrets. Miss Marple had spent a lifetime observing human nature, and she knew that guilt rarely revealed itself in grand gestures. It lurked in the small things. She sat quietly in Edith Weatherby's sitting room, her knitting needles moving with steady precision as the suspects came and went. Their words were carefully measured, but their bodies spoke a different language. Richard Carrington, so eager to be seen as composed, had a habit of answering too quickly, as though he had rehearsed his lines. He was a man who had prepared for questions before they were ever asked. Lillian Drake, eyes darting, hands fidgeting, contradicted herself within minutes. Estelle was anxious that night, she had said. Then later, she seemed almost at peace. Which was it? Dr. Graves, always confident in his diagnosis, now seemed too rigid, too careful, as if any slip of the tongue might reveal too much. And Matthew Lawson, who had once been a silent onlooker, suddenly had far too much to say. Miss Marple sipped her tea, letting the conversation flow around her, offering only a pleasant smile. Each of them was hiding something, and the more they tried to mask it, the clearer it became. Miss Marple had long believed that murders were rarely about the present. They were about the past coming to collect its due. It was a stray remark from an old friend that set her on the right path. "Poor Estelle," murmured the vicar's wife over tea. "She tried so hard to leave it behind her." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused. "Leave what behind, dear?" The woman hesitated, then sighed. "There was an incident, years ago. Something to do with a man from London. It was hushed up, of course. Richard insisted on it." Miss Marple's lips pressed together in thought. Blackmail. Had Estelle's so-called premonition been nothing more than the slow realization that someone had discovered her secret? That someone was using it against her? Had she been paying for her silence? Until she refused. Miss Marple had seen it before. The past did not remain buried. It had a way of digging itself out at the worst possible moment, and sometimes people would kill to keep it in the ground. Miss Marple had spent the morning inspecting the grand staircase of Carrington House, moving with the quiet patience of someone who already knew what she would find. A house of that age creaked underfoot, but something wasn't right. She reached into her handbag, pulling out a handkerchief, and ran it carefully along one of the middle steps. A faint, greasy sheen clung to the fabric, subtle but unmistakable. She held it up to the light. Oil. Too fine to see, too smooth to detect underfoot, but just enough to send an unsuspecting woman tumbling to her death. No accident. A careful, deliberate act. And then, there was the banister. A housemaid had remarked that it had been polished just that morning, yet there were no fingerprints, no last desperate grasp, because Estelle had not had a chance to catch herself. Miss Marple exhaled. It was staged. Not only had the murderer known Estelle would use the stairs that night, but they had ensured she would not survive the descent, and they had done so with calculated precision. Rumors in a village were much like ivy on an old stone wall. They clung, spread, and refused to let go. By mid-morning, a fresh whisper had begun to circulate. Someone had seen a figure near Carrington House on the night of Estelle's death. Someone who should not have been there. The revelation came from Mr. Pritchard, the elderly groundskeeper at the vicarage. He had not spoken sooner, he admitted, because he was old, not foolish, and he knew that some things were best left unsaid. But after a restless night and a troubled conscience, he sought out Miss Marple. "I saw someone near the house that night," he said, his voice rough with age but firm with certainty. "Near the side entrance, the one facing the orchard." Miss Marple looked up from her knitting. "And who was it, Mr. Pritchard?" "That's the trouble, ma'am," he muttered. "It was someone who swore they were somewhere else." A direct contradiction. Someone had lied. Miss Marple gently pressed for details. The height, the movement, the hesitation before they slipped into the shadows. Mr. Pritchard did not see a face, but he was certain of one thing. They had moved with purpose. Whoever they were, they had not come upon the house by chance. They had gone there for a reason, and that reason, Miss Marple suspected, was murder. Miss Marple had long known that the guilty always reveal themselves, if given the right nudge. It was not enough to suspect. The truth had to be drawn out, forced into the light. And so, she set about laying a trap. She did not use confrontation. That would only lead to denials and excuses. Instead, she chose something far more effective. Human nature itself. A casual remark here, a knowing glance there, a stray comment, placed just so, suggesting that a witness had seen more than they let on. By midday, the village was buzzing with speculation. Someone had been seen. Someone had been placed near the house at the crucial hour. Miss Marple watched each suspect carefully. Who avoided her gaze? Who suddenly seemed anxious to leave the village? Who made the fatal mistake of speaking before they should? She did not rush. She simply waited. And then, just as she expected, the guilty party began to unravel. It was only a matter of time. Chapter 6. The Confrontation. The Carrington residence had never felt so oppressively still. The heavy drapes muted the light, and the air inside was thick, not with warmth, but with something unspoken, unacknowledged. Miss Marple sat in a high-backed chair, her hands resting lightly in her lap, her eyes moving carefully across the assembled suspects. Richard Carrington, his expression unreadable, sat with his arms crossed, his fingers tapping idly against the fabric of his sleeve. Lillian Drake, pale and restless, shifted in her seat, her eyes flicking toward the door as if weighing the possibility of escape. Dr. Henry Graves, usually so composed, now seemed uncharacteristically tense, his jaw tightening each time Miss Marple's gaze lingered on him. Matthew Lawson, the quiet bookseller, sat apart from the others, his fingers worrying the edge of his cuff. He had spoken little, but his eyes moved too much, darting from face to face. Miss Marple cleared her throat gently. "I appreciate you all coming," she said, her voice pleasant, almost conversational. "You see, there are still a few matters that trouble me." No one spoke. The room seemed to contract slightly. "I have always believed," she continued, "that people reveal more in their silence than in their words. And I must say, there has been an awful lot of silence about Estelle's death." Lillian exhaled sharply. Richard shifted. A clock ticked somewhere in the house, marking the slow passage of time. Miss Marple smiled, though there was nothing warm about it. "Shall we begin?" Miss Marple let the silence settle before she spoke again. "I keep returning to Estelle's final words," she said. "A curious thing, really. The staircase is too silent." She let the phrase hang in the air. "You see, it struck me as odd, at first. A house of this age. Well, wooden staircases tend to creak, do they not?" Lillian gave a slight nod. "Ours does. Loudly." "Yes, precisely." Miss Marple folded her hands. "And yet, Estelle noticed something strange. She expected the stairs to creak, but they did not." A pause. A flicker of reaction in Richard's eyes. The faintest tightening of Dr. Graves's mouth. "Which tells us two things," Miss Marple continued. "First, she was not alone in that moment. She heard something. Or rather, she did not hear something. And it disturbed her enough to remark upon it. And second," she glanced at Richard, "someone had tampered with the stairs beforehand." A breath of tension rippled through the room. Miss Marple tilted her head. "Polished, perhaps, waxed, or something else entirely?" Matthew Lawson exhaled shakily. "Oil," he muttered. "It would make them smooth. Too smooth." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "Yes, it would." She leaned back slightly, allowing the weight of her words to settle. "So, you see," she said, her voice light but firm, "Estelle's death was not fate. Not a prophecy fulfilled. It was something far more deliberate. And across from her, someone stopped breathing for just a fraction of a second too long." The room was thick with unease, each person waiting for Miss Marple's next words. She reached into her handbag and produced a small, dark scrap of fabric, laying it gently on the table before her. "This," she said, her voice calm but firm, "was found clutched in Estelle's hand." A ripple of tension moved through the gathered suspects. No one spoke, but their eyes said enough. Miss Marple continued, her fingers brushing over the torn edges. "It does not match her gown, which can only mean one thing. It belongs to someone else. Someone who was near enough for Estelle to grab at the very last moment." She let her gaze drift slowly across the room, watching for the slight flicker of recognition, the involuntary reaction. Then, quite deliberately, she turned to Richard Carrington. His face remained carefully composed, but Miss Marple had already noted the missing piece from the cuff of his dressing robe. "Shall we compare them?" she suggested mildly. For a long moment no one moved. Then Richard exhaled sharply, pushing back his chair. "This is absurd. You're making wild assumptions based on nothing more than an old woman's paranoia." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Oh, but you see, Mr. Carrington, it isn't paranoia when it turns out to be true." Richard's hand twitched at his side, a fraction of hesitation, a moment too long, and Miss Marple knew. He had been with Estelle that night. Miss Marple let the silence sit before speaking again. "This was never about fate," she said, her voice crisp yet measured. "Estelle Carrington's death was designed, a tragedy carefully orchestrated to look like a prophecy fulfilled." Richard scoffed, but there was an edge of unease in his eyes. Miss Marple continued, "You knew, Mr. Carrington, that Estelle had convinced herself of her impending death. It wasn't difficult to use that against her. To set the stage, so to speak." She turned to the others. The staircase was tampered with. The doors were locked. The very thing that should have saved her, her own instinct for danger, became the trap you set. Lillian let out a sharp breath, shaking her head. "But why? Why go to such lengths?" Miss Marple's expression softened slightly. "Because Estelle changed her will." A small sound of shock from Matthew Lawson, a nervous swallow from Dr. Graves. Miss Marple nodded. "She altered the terms, didn't she, Mr. Carrington? And you couldn't afford to let that stand." Richard remained rigid, his jaw tight, but his silence was as telling as a confession. The prophecy had never been real. The only thing inevitable about Estelle's death was the man who had ensured it. Richard Carrington lunged from his chair. The sudden movement startled Lillian, who let out a cry, while Dr. Graves instinctively stepped back. But Miss Marple did not flinch. "I won't sit here and listen to this nonsense," Richard snapped, his voice tight with barely contained panic. "You're all fools. Estelle was unstable, His foot shifted, his breath hitched. Miss Marple simply folded her hands. "You were careful," she mused, "but not careful enough." Richard's lips parted. Then, just for a moment, his mask slipped. "You have no proof," he hissed. "You have nothing." Miss Marple sighed, almost as if disappointed. "Ah, but we do. Your own words just now, Mr. Carrington. You never denied being there that night, only that we could prove it." A flicker of realization. He had said too much. The moment stretched thin as wire. Then, before anyone could react, Richard bolted for the door. But he was not quick enough. A firm hand, Dr. Graves, despite his earlier apprehension, caught his arm, halting him mid-step. Richard struggled, but the fight had already left him. Miss Marple, watching quietly, offered only a small shake of her head. "There is no escape from the truth, Mr. Carrington." And indeed, there wasn't. Chapter 7. The Final Twist. Richard Carrington stopped struggling. His breath was uneven, his hands clenched at his sides. The weight of Miss Marple's words had settled over him like a shroud. Then, at last, he spoke. "Fine," he muttered, his voice low. "Yes, I was there that night. I went to see Estelle. We argued." A pause, a flicker of hesitation. Then, as if forcing himself to believe his own words, he continued. "She was unstable. Kept talking about fate, about seeing her own death. She must have lost her footing." Miss Marple tilted her head. "And the fabric in her hand?" His jaw tightened. "I don't know. Maybe she grabbed at me in panic." A vague answer, a carefully chosen vagueness, Miss Marple's knitting needles rested in her lap. She did not speak. She simply waited. Richard's shoulders sagged. "I didn't mean for it to happen," he murmured. "But she was always so fragile." Lillian let out a quiet gasp. Dr. Graves glanced away. And yet, something was wrong. Miss Marple had heard confessions before. Some were desperate, trembling things. Others were calculated, cold admissions of guilt. But this was neither. His words felt off, as though he were reciting a script given to him, rather than revealing the truth. Miss Marple's fingers curled gently over her knitting. No, she thought. This was not over. Not yet. Because someone else had been pulling the strings all along. Miss Marple exhaled softly, her eyes never leaving Richard Carrington. "No," she said at last, her voice calm but firm. "That won't do at all." Richard looked up sharply. "What?" "You didn't kill her," Miss Marple said simply. "You were there, yes. You argued, yes. But Estelle was already a dead woman, walking long before you set foot in that house." A stillness fell over the room. Miss Marple's gaze moved past Richard, settling on Lillian Drake. Lillian's hands were folded in her lap. Her eyes were wide, almost too wide. And she was silent, too silent. "You were the one who encouraged Estelle's fears, weren't you?" Miss Marple continued, her voice as gentle as ever. "Whispered about fate, reinforced her belief that she would die, and when she changed her will, well, that must have been quite a disappointment." Lillian's lips parted. "That's ridiculous. I was her friend." Miss Marple gave a small nod. "Yes. And who else would she confide in, if not a trusted friend?" Lillian's breath hitched. "You were the one who ensured the stairs were slick with oil, weren't you? Who planted the idea of an inevitable death so that when it came, no one would question it?" Richard turned toward Lillian, confusion in his eyes. "Lillian," Miss Marple simply continued, her voice unwavering. "You didn't have to push her yourself," she said softly. "You just had to make her walk willingly into her own doom." And finally, Lillian Drake broke the silence. Miss Marple sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap. The room had fallen into a stunned silence. Lillian Drake did not speak. Her face was pale, her breath uneven. But Miss Marple was in no hurry. She let the weight of her words settle before continuing. "It was a rather ingenious plan," she said at last. "You knew Estelle well, Lillian. You knew how much she feared what she believed was inevitable. And so you did what all truly clever murderers do. You made your victim walk willingly into their own doom." A soft gasp. Lillian's hands clenched in her lap. "You reinforced her fears, encouraged them. And when the time came, you did not push her. You simply made sure that when she walked to her fate, there was no way back." Miss Marple glanced at Richard Carrington. "You see, Richard, your guilt lay not in the act of murder, but in your silence. You suspected, didn't you? But it was far more convenient to let events unfold." Richard's jaw tightened. A man who had been complicit, but not the mastermind. Miss Marple turned back to Lillian. The torn fabric, the deliberate silence of the stairs, the oiled steps, and, of course, the final piece, the revised will. You had everything to gain and nothing to lose. Lillian exhaled sharply, a sound somewhere between a sob and a laugh. Miss Marple gave a small nod. The puzzle was complete, and the picture it painted was damning. Lillian was taken away, her protests growing fainter as she disappeared down the corridor. Richard Carrington stood motionless, staring at the floor. He had not tried to stop it. He had not tried to save her, perhaps because he too had seen it coming. Dr. Graves shook his head. She really believed it, didn't she? That she was meant to die. Miss Marple gave a slight smile, though there was no joy in it. That was the brilliance of the crime, you see. She was killed long before she ever set foot on those stairs. Her mind was made up for her. Lillian had not needed to lift a hand. She had only needed to ensure that Estelle walked to her fate without question. A crime of manipulation, not brute force. Miss Marple sighed. Justice has been served, but there's something that troubles me. Dr. Graves frowned. What is that? Miss Marple's eyes drifted toward the window. If Estelle had not believed in her own death, would she still be alive? The thought lingered. Had she been murdered, or had she been led into fulfilling her own prophecy? Miss Marple could not say for certain, and perhaps, in the end, that was the true mystery. Mellingford faded into the distance as Miss Marple sat in the carriage, her knitting resting in her lap. She had solved many murders in her time, and yet, something about this one stayed with her. It was not the deception, nor the cruelty of it. She had seen worse. It was the lingering question, the one that could never truly be answered. Had Estelle foreseen her own death, or had she been made to believe in the inevitable? Had the crime been perfectly calculated, or had something unexplainable slipped through the cracks of logic? The village disappeared behind the rolling hills. The air was cool, the afternoon quiet. Miss Marple closed her eyes for a moment. Some mysteries, she supposed, were never meant to be solved. And perhaps, just perhaps, that was the most unsettling thought of all.